Thanks for doing this, and welcome back to Alberta.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was good to be there. It was good to be back.
How often are you out in Ottawa?
I've only been to Ottawa maybe 4 times in the last couple of years. Like, not often, maybe a couple of times a year, but I think that this week, was a really important time to be there, just especially given that was the day that we were making our submission on the oil and gas emissions cap, and having a meeting with Minister Schulz I thought was important, and being there to support the Premier as we opened an Alberta office was pretty exciting too. Just so much excitement for it, and I think there are a lot of people looking to invest in and do work in and move to Alberta. And I think it makes sense that we have an office there to help make those connections. And it's a great place, certainly for us to use as a resource when we're out there.
Did you always know you're going to be a politician? Or how did this journey begin?
Yeah, I didn't always know. I knew that I liked politics. And so I kind of fell into working in politics. I started in political studies in university, and then honestly, kind of fell out of it for a couple of years. I completed an English degree, wanted to get into public relations, communications, was working in Saskatchewan for the natural gas company there. And we got to do a lot of work with the minister's office because it was a Crown corporation. So I would watch Question Period every day and develop materials for the minister's office. And I really loved that part of my role. And when a job opened up in Premier Wall's office, my boss had reached out to his communications director at the time. And I came in the next day. I had said, how does somebody get that job? And I came in the next day and he said, if you want that job, she would love to have you there. And I knew her before. And so I essentially applied and interviewed and fell into my first role in politics working in the Premier's office. And I just loved it. It was exciting. And, I was so fortunate to work for Premier Wall, a great politician, but just an amazing human who really, really was in it because he wanted to serve his neighbors and leave the province a better place. And I was so inspired by him. And there were a few other politicians that I was able to work with that I just remember thinking, I want to do this. I want to be able to take people's ideas and hopes and feedback on how things are going and actually make change to make our province better. And, I remember also watching one of the ministers I was working with talk to a group of grade 6 students from his home riding when they were touring the legislature there, and just seeing him share his passion with just a new generation of people and inspiring a love of politics and an interest in what was happening at the provincial level. Like, that was so inspiring to me. So when I then got involved, I campaigned, and it was then when I was working in politics that I knew that, someday I think I want to run.
What made you move out further west to Alberta?
You know what? I loved growing up in Saskatchewan, and I always, though, knew I wanted something different. And the pull of Alberta for me was really just that endless opportunity. And I know it almost sounds cliche to those of us who live here now, that it was a place where it was just limitless potential and the promise that if you wanted to work hard, you could chart your own path. That, for me, working in communications, it wasn't just, make good connections, you'll work in government for a long time and then you'll retire. For me, it was, there was, I think, a pull of career and opportunities that I probably couldn't even articulate or imagine. And, we knew people who lived in Calgary. Everybody seemed to love it. And my husband and I at the time, he was offered a job. I was about to have our first child. And, I knew that was kind of one of the things. Our families weren't really happy about it, but I could not pass up that opportunity. and I've never regretted it. I love Alberta. I love Albertans. I love Calgary. It is just as exciting. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't necessarily in 2015, and I can tell you a little bit about why I got involved in Alberta politics. But, it's just this amazing place where there is so much ingenuity, opportunity, a hum of energy and excitement, but yet people are just so friendly, like hardworking, help your neighbors. That's how I grew up in rural Saskatchewan, and that's what I found here. And so I love it.
How was your parents when you started saying, Mom, Dad, I'm going into politics here in Alberta now? I didn't just move here, now I'm in politics.
Yeah, I think that was when they knew for sure I was never coming back. That, I think they probably always hoped, maybe they'll come back. But, my parents were not surprised, nor were my siblings when I said I was moving to Calgary. And they definitely were not surprised when I said I was going to run for politics. And honestly, we couldn't have done it without them. They came out and helped us at that point. When I first ran for a nomination in 2018, that baby that we moved out here with was 3, and my daughter was 4 months old. So we couldn't have done it without our family. And it was, again, one of the things that kind of inspired me to run was, I think my kids deserve somebody who's going to fight for them. And I wanted to see people like me, young working families, just normal people representing us in government. And, a new party at the time, it was, I thought, a good opportunity to just jump in.
In 2015, you mentioned there were some changes happening or some challenges.
I mean, when I moved here and in 2019, and I was on maternity leave, and I was walking my son around the walking paths of Calgary, and I would meet people who had just lost their jobs or were devastated by the state of the economy, who had no idea how this happened in a place like Alberta. And to watch a government really disregard our major industries and make decisions that, essentially policy decisions that told the investment community, all of the job creators, that, look, we're not open for business. And it was not like, it wasn't that exciting place that I thought it was going to be, right? It was people I knew being laid off every single day. It was me being on maternity leave, worrying about where I was going to be able to find a job. I mean, I didn't really know that many people here. And so it's what made me, I went back to work quite early when my son was a baby, because I thought, oh my gosh, I've been offered a job. In this type of economy, you don't know when that next offer is coming. And so you just take it. It was devastating. And so that was something that I felt, I had the opportunity of seeing in Saskatchewan that, for a long time, people left Saskatchewan. I'm not the only person who chose to come here. I often joke, probably a third of the people I represent in my riding came from Saskatchewan to Calgary.
Have you been to a Stamps game before?
But it's, and I kind of chalk it up to, we had an NDP government in Saskatchewan for 14 years, and people didn't stay, right? They don't stay when you have a government that is against free market growth and the prosperity and opportunity it brings. And so I just remember thinking, if we could see in a premier like Premier Brad Wall, how a pro-growth, free market government could literally change the trajectory of a province to create opportunity, to create population growth because people wanted to be there. I saw that the other way, got to Alberta, and then saw this decline. And I just thought, this is not what I came here for. There is a better way. And that's actually what got me involved in Alberta politics.
When you got into politics, I'm sure you heard, you're going to need some thick skin. Now more than ever, we got social media, we have the internet, AI now, even to create voiceovers where people might say, I didn't say that.
Yeah.
How was it campaigning, trying to maneuver through things and then deal with social media, especially X?
Yeah, I would say in the 2019 election, there was something very real. For me, it was I was always a little bit nervous about social media and, kind of the just personal nature of politics. And I mean, this election, I would say, was probably the worst I've ever seen in my political experience and career, just in terms of the misinformation and the mischaracterization of politicians coming from the opposition. And, but what happened to me specifically in the 2019 campaign, I just remember having a nervousness about it, seeing some of the personal attacks against then Premier Jason Kenney as we were running. And one day, all of a sudden, my phone starts going off. I'm getting all sorts of messages. And there was a tweet. And essentially, I can't remember the exact wording of the tweet. I'm sure I probably still have it somewhere if I went and looked back. But, essentially, it was horrific about, some of my views about different groups within society. And I just remember sitting down on my kitchen floor and calling our central campaign team and saying, look, I don't believe this. I never would have tweeted this. I don't believe this, and I never talk like this. And because I had worked in politics, I always kind of assumed my social media was public anyways. And so sure enough, we were able to find, and the giveaway was my photo and my last name, because they used an old handle, I think, or a new handle with an old photo that I didn't use at the time. And we were able to see that it was Photoshopped. And actually, in that case, somebody from the NDP campaign said, even they came to my defense on Twitter saying, okay, we know Rebecca, we know she wouldn't say that. Doesn't mean we like your party, some people probably have those views, but Rebecca would never have tweeted that. But it was a reminder of just how that could actually happen. And now, you read social media any day, and read the comments. Like I could tell at the beginning when my mom used to call me and say, how are you doing today? And I could tell something was wrong. And ultimately I thought, oh gosh, yeah, she's been reading my Facebook comments again. I don't take it as personally now as maybe I did early on. And I think, it's tough when things get personal and it becomes no longer a discussion of policy or opinion or critical thinking, but it becomes, attacks on one's intelligence or integrity.
Or family even.
And family even. I think that is always tough. And I just had a mom at hockey last night ask me about that too. How, does that bother you when people say that? Because it just seems so over the top when, I actually really like what you're doing on a certain policy. And, I think I often just try to remember it's not always about me.
It's a projection.
Well, and sometimes, yeah, when people don't have to identify with their own name, and oftentimes it's numbers and a fake photo and they can kind of say whatever they want. But ultimately it's having the conviction to know that you're doing the right thing. And in politics, I would say this even when I first ran, I would tell people, look, I'm not going to make you happy all the time. You're not going to agree with every single decision we make. But I will always stand here and listen to your feedback. I want to hear your perspectives. I think different perspectives make for better policy. But the personal attacks and social media, it's unfortunate. And unfortunately, I think it turns a lot of people away from public office who would be fantastic in those roles.
For the folks that wonder, how do you stay sane, mentally, physically, emotionally, through it all, the ups, the downs, the highs even? How do you stay neutral and say, okay, another day, another step? Let's say that.
Yeah, I think it's surrounding yourself with people who just, can remind you of, the fact that it's really not about you. And I remember early on, there was something that really kind of offended me. And it was on the childcare file, and I was Minister of Children's Services early on. And it probably had something to do with the fact that, this minister doesn't care about working parents or things like that. I'm sure it was something like that. And in fact, my children were very young. Without good childcare, I wouldn't be able to do this job. And I remember showing my husband the message. I was like, oh gosh, I can't believe somebody said this about me. And I remember him saying, if that hurts your feelings, you're probably in the wrong job. And he was right, because, that just kind of happens. But, I try not, like, I don't read the comments. I try not to all of the time. I do still like to check. And, I think you see then other people now, there are people who are confident and often come and try to support your policies or things like that. But, I just think generally speaking, it's not just about the comments. It is an intense job. I mean, it's go, go, go. And so I think mental health is pretty important. It's top of mind in a lot of different careers. And I mean, now I'm glad it's a topic of conversation. It's something that people talk about. Whereas maybe before they didn't. But for me, also, my physical health is pretty linked to that. And I think I know you started working out at F45. I've been there. I love it. I was there at 6:00 this morning. I also run. So, for me, spending time with my family, making sure, that I have that carved out in my day and actually scheduled, because sometimes these jobs can just, they can schedule your whole life away. There are things every night, every morning, every weekend, but making sure that I have time for physical activity, fresh air, spending good quality time with my family, and also having some time to think and reflect. It's one thing to have time to read briefing notes and things like that, but sometimes you also just need time carved out to plan and to be strategic. So those are some of the ways that I've chosen to stay sane, or certainly what works for me isn't what works for everybody.
Rebecca, when you look at challenges today in terms of being a Minister of Environment versus your previous job as Minister, is it the same challenges in terms of same lashback, or is it amplified?
I would say at a time like this, environment is a very front and center file. But I think, depending on what's happening, I mean, with right now, it's happening with the federal government that has really elevated this role in terms of the federal government's attacks on, you name it, our energy industry, our agriculture industry, our electricity grid. It's honestly, it's an honor to be in this role and to be entrusted with representing Albertans and Albertans' best interests and the resources that, they belong to Albertans. It's our job to steward those resources. So it's an honor to be in this role at that time. It is definitely, front and center in the media with what's going on. And so that comes with, unique challenges too. But, it's such an amazing opportunity. And I feel so strongly about it. In a province like Alberta, this is not about saying no to growth and to opportunities. It is about saying, look, we live in a province that we have a resource-based economy. I am proud of our energy industry. I'm proud of our agriculture industry. I really am. And we see more and more people calling Alberta home every single day. I think somebody said that we're growing the fastest we've grown, I think since the 40s, but certainly for decades. And so, at a time like this, I think it's important to know that my role and the role of Environment Minister is to absolutely uphold our environmental standards, to make sure that we have access to water, that the quality of air is protected, that we are protecting biodiversity. I think about, another reason why I wanted to come to Alberta. It is one of the most beautiful places in the whole world, right? With the rivers and the mountains and the grasslands. It's exceptional, every area of our province. So this is not about saying, how do we just develop? It's about how do we develop and grow our major industries, develop new subdivisions so we can have affordable housing for people who want to live in this province and still maintain our higher environmental standards. And so, I don't believe that's an either or. I think you can do both. I absolutely do. And so I think that's really the challenge, I think, in being in a position where we're growing so rapidly and demand for our major industries. Of course, in energy, global energy demand is going up every single day. So how do we make sure that we're meeting those demands and still taking care of our environment?
When it comes to fossil fuels, does the name Charlie Angus and his bill Do you mind sharing a little bit about that for people that
Yeah.
don't listen to the news?
I'm going to pull up the exact wording of this bill, and I know it because I sent it to a couple of folks yesterday because it frustrated me so much. But essentially, what this bill is proposing to do, and this is around they call it the promotion of fossil fuels. And so, what this bill would do, and I'm going to read it. One of the sections says it is prohibited for a person to promote a fossil fuel or the production of a fossil fuel, A, in a manner that states or suggests that the fossil fuel, its production, or its emissions are less harmful than other fossil fuels, their production or their emissions. B, in a manner that states or suggests that a fossil fuel or the practices of a producer of the fossil fuel industry would lead to positive outcomes in relation to the environment, the health of Canadians, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, or the Canadian or global economy. So I'm just going to break down what that actually means, practically speaking. If it is prohibited for somebody to promote that one fossil fuel, its productions or emissions are less harmful than other fossil fuels, that means we can no longer say that it is better to produce, develop, and use natural gas than it is to produce, develop, or use coal. That is a fact. That is not an opinion. That is a fact. And under this bill, that would not be allowed. When you look at the second part of that you can't talk about the fact that a fossil fuel or the practices of a producer or the industry would lead to positive outcomes in relation to the environment. CCUS. So is that saying that we actually can't talk about the fact that carbon capture, utilization, and storage allows us to safely and permanently store emissions underground? Wow, that's wild to me, to not be able to talk about the fact that reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is also encouraged by our energy industry. In the last week, we've seen a number of Indigenous organizations come out and oppose the oil and gas cap because economic prosperity, jobs, and opportunities matter to Indigenous communities as well. And then not being able to talk about the impacts to the Canadian or global economy. I mean, this oil and gas cap is about to threaten hundreds of thousands of jobs, millions to our Alberta GDP. I think upwards of trillions, some of the estimates show when it comes to the Canadian GDP and economy. And so, the very real reality, and this is fact, this is not my opinion, is that impacts the ability of a provincial government to invest in healthcare and education. The Canadian government also would feel those impacts. And so to now have the NDP bringing forward a bill that says that having any of those conversations would be illegal, that's banning our ability to talk factually about our energy industry, which that should be scary. That should be scary for Canadians, that when we look at the fact that because of other liberal legislation, we can't access news articles on Facebook or Instagram. And now we have somebody saying we can't actually share the truth about our energy industry. I mean, this should be scary for Canadians to see what not only, this is an NDP MP, but essentially saying that the only information that can be shared publicly, legally, is the information that aligns with my ideology of the world, and then silencing the other side. I honestly, I was so blown away by it yesterday. I think that Canadians and Albertans, but especially Canadians, they need to see what is being brought forward here, because you're right, it is about freedom, but it's also about being able to have a discussion about the very real reality of it. In this case, it's about our oil and gas industry, but this industry employs hundreds of thousands of Canadians. It drives our economy. It allows us to stay warm in the winter. I can tell you, I was touring natural gas facilities in January when it was minus 35 or minus 50 with the wind chill, when my flights were all canceled. I can tell you, I was a pretty grateful Canadian for our energy industry. And so, not only am I concerned with what's being brought forward, but now I want to know, well, what does our provincial NDP say about this? I mean, I want to know, do they support that policy? Do they think that it's right to silence views that are not the views that you hold? I mean, it's this industry has driven our economy for generations. It is what's driving innovation when it comes to emissions reduction. It really is. I mean, we're leaders on that front too. And so this is really, I think, a worrisome path. And of course, we all know that the provincial and federal NDP parties are linked. I want to know, is that what the Alberta NDP believes as well? Because that's a pretty scary thought.
At times you probably think this is all a nightmare and this is not a reality. What do you think goes through their mind to make sense of all this? Because oftentimes we can see the obvious, but trying to understand them, what do you think it is?
I mean, so I often say, when Minister Guilbeault and I meet, I would say they're pleasant conversations. We are sharing ideas, but I also know that he is coming from a very, very different perspective than I am. And so, I think when we see policies like this coming forward, the federal MPs in these parties, because at this point, it's not just the Justin Trudeau Liberals. This is something being brought forward by the NDP, that they are choosing ideology over common sense. And what I think is encouraging to me is we are starting to see that Canadians recognize that, and I think of, the carbon tax, for example. Obviously in Alberta, we were opposed to the carbon tax, of course. And we have brought it, we have fought the carbon tax in court. We have made motions for the federal government to repeal the carbon tax, just looking at the fact that it's driving up the cost of living for everyday people, the cost of heating our homes, of gas, of groceries, but it's not having an impact on emissions reduction, which is, what the federal government is saying it's there to do. So you're starting to see Canadians say, wait, like we can't do this anymore. Especially in Atlantic Canada and what we saw with the carve out there. It was recognition that, of course, this is driving up the cost of people heating their homes, which is not a necessity in a Canadian winter, or like it's not a choice, it's a necessity in a Canadian winter. But you see Canadians starting to say, okay, yeah, this isn't okay, right? And, I think not only that is what gives me some hope and optimism, it's also now seeing the courts say, Bill C-69, unconstitutional, the plastics ban, unreasonable and unconstitutional. I think that Canadians are starting to see that this pattern is reckless. It is disrespectful of the Constitution, and their approach is disrespectful of the laws of our country. So, I think it gives me some optimism that Canadians are seeing this. Our courts are seeing this and making decisions in that way, but it still shows that the Liberal and NDP, they're choosing this ideology over common sense every time.
For the folks that are trying to understand what a carbon tax is or carbon pricing, how could you explain it, Rebecca?
Well, how would I would explain it as a cash grab, but what the federal government is, what they have essentially said, what the Liberals have said is, look, if we create a tax that is so high that it changes somebody's behavior and maybe, causes them to make different decisions that would reduce emissions, that's, I think, what they're trying to do with the carbon tax, right? But we don't have a choice but to drive our cars. You think of, I represent a suburban constituency in Calgary. Rural folks don't have any choice. You're driving your kids to activities, you're headed to work, you're driving them to school. This is just such a punitive tax on everyday families, and it's not bringing down emissions because it's not a choice. It's not. And, I just think, again, they say it's a climate plan, but it's not a climate plan because it's not having an impact on the environment. It's the federal government can't even tell us, what emissions reductions have come from this carbon tax. So, how I would describe it is it's, the federal government, it's a cash grab where they're taxing Canadians and then redistributing the money and saying that it's in the name of the environment, but it's not. It's just another top-down policy from the federal Liberal NDP coalition, and it's really, I think, it's really hurting everyday Canadians.
What happens when there's a carbon tax and it increases? We've seen it with the housing crisis right now, especially here in Alberta. That's one of them. Heating your homes.
Yeah.
They've said, I think it was at 14 cents is going to go up to 19 cents if they keep this up.
Yeah. Well, and I should also point out, I've met with school divisions who said, of course, their bills have gone up exponentially. So dollars that a school division would typically put into supporting kids in classrooms is now going to pay a carbon tax. It, as you said, it for your personal use, it also drives up the cost of everything, your home heating. I had a woman a couple months ago just stop me in the grocery store and was commenting on the price of butter, right? I mean, when somebody's standing there with a brick of butter in their hands and just saying, I mean, they didn't know who I was or what I was doing. She was just saying, can you believe that this is the cost of a price of butter and, lettuce, and was just talking about just the inflationary pressures that she's seeing on her groceries and how much she can get for $100 of groceries now versus before. This is absolutely impacting our day-to-day lives. And, I think when we look at that, our job as a politician, my job is to represent the perspectives of the people who I was elected to represent. I haven't heard Canadians saying, I love this carbon tax. I don't have any constituents who say, I love this carbon tax, especially because it's not having an impact on what they're saying it's trying to do. Instead, this is how out of touch they are. The conversation is, we'll just give it a new name. We'll give it a rebrand, and maybe Canadians will like it more. Canadians are smart.
That's an insult.
Absolutely. I think that just adds insult to injury and is so disrespectful of Canadians.
Are you for LNG? Are you for wind, solar?
Yeah. Here's what I would say. The Premier often says it best when she says, we take an all the above approach in Alberta. And when I came to this role as Minister of Environment, our emissions reduction and energy development plan, it was rolled out by my predecessor, Minister Savage. And of course, the Premier was very supportive. And what that was about was essentially right in the title, we're going to continue to develop energy, but we're going to reduce emissions and protect the environment. So, we've seen a lot of renewable investment. I think 75% or over last year of renewable investment was in Alberta. It's awesome to see that we are leading when it comes to technology. Carbon capture, utilization, storage is one of those areas. I would say geothermal. I was with Ever, a Calgary company, where their expertise and knowledge from the oil sands is helping to meet the energy demands in Germany. This is awesome. Again, a company is so proud of our energy industry and also the future and testing new technologies. And, we take an all the above approach. And I mean, when we look at our emissions reduction goals, essentially, I often point out that these are really goals that industry has set and industry has committed to, and industry has identified as areas where certain technologies are needed to get us there, but also recognizing that, energy demand and the cost of energy, it matters to everyday people. And so we don't want to phase out our energy industry. Well, we don't in Alberta, I'll tell you that. My colleagues and I and our Premier do not want to phase out our energy industry. I'm certain, that is maybe what other federal politicians want to see happen. But for us, we want to continue to meet the world's energy demands, to produce safe, environmentally responsibly produced energy while reducing emissions. And I think that's a key piece, that we are reducing emissions. We're not reducing production, because obviously demand is going up. So, I again think that this is exactly the same ingenuity and big thinking and entrepreneurial thinking that put Alberta on the map as an energy powerhouse for the last number of decades. So now it's pretty cool to see, even at places like COP, right, where the discussion, some people are there, talking about phasing out fossil fuels. A lot of the discussion that I think was important was recognizing if you want to reduce global emissions, then Alberta has what the world needs. Then we do need to get our LNG to market. We have an opportunity to replace less environmentally produced forms of energy by making sure that Alberta and Canadian energy is meeting those demands. So absolutely, I think on that front, the Premier's been pretty clear, and she's been taking that message, I would say, worldwide, which is positive. And I think that there's even some agreement with BC. There's some good work happening between the premiers of those two provinces. And I know it's something that other countries, like even potentially Japan, are quite excited about. So, I think if people also want to talk about things like hydrogen, we have a hydrogen center of excellence. We're showing leadership when it comes to the petrochemical industry, and how we can make sure, not by banning plastic straws, but by saying, there's a way that we can actually recycle more plastics and use those plastics and create an economy for those materials, and making sure that they're not ending up in our lakes, our streams, our rivers. But in fact, they're benefiting the economy and meeting our demands for those types of products. And so that's where I think, again, it comes down to common sense over ideology, right? Every time. What the federal government is doing on that front too, it's actually going to have the opposite effect on all of that innovation that's happening.
I think I saw CPKC do something with their locomotives and hydrogen, which was pretty neat. You got to try things, and you got to test and see if it works.
Absolutely. And anytime you're trying new technology, there are going to be challenges that have to be overcome, or things that you need to test and problems that you need to solve. But when I look at how all of our major industries have evolved over the last number of decades, methane emissions reduction is a good example. When I was touring in January, it was just funny because they were talking about reducing methane emissions, and they talked about it like it was no big deal. Why? Because they've been doing it for 12 years, I think.
Was that Birchcliff?
That was when I was at Birchcliff, and they said, this is they call it a low emission well site, but effectively it doesn't have emissions. But low emissions, is typically how they refer to it. They have solar installed on that facility to help generate energy. There's less land disturbance, less water use than before, and of course, reduced methane emissions, which is part of why we were able to meet our 45% reduction goal 3 years ahead of schedule. And we did it for $600 million less cost to industry. If we had done it the way that the feds would have wanted to roll that out. So, it's just it's interesting because to them it was not really a big deal because it has just become part of what they do. So that innovation is what's going to allow us to solve future challenges when we're looking at all this other technology.
Could you see Alberta in our lifetime supplying our nation with oil, or just an energy resource?
This is where, I think that that's the responsible thing to do. When I look at our record when it comes to environmental stewardship, when it comes to our human rights standards, of course, there's no question. We also, though, right now have a federal government with all of the uncertainty in their regulations and all of the additional costs. It's tough when they're looking for capital. What it's done to our industry from a competitiveness perspective. The economics of it get more challenging with every level of regulation that the federal government layers on, right? And with uncertainty right now, that's, I think, one of the biggest barriers that we face, quite frankly, in our industry, and just moving forward. But again, I think the reality is that Canadians want access to affordable, reliable, secure energy sources. We have that energy. We're not the only province that has that energy either, right? Like, I like to talk about this as like, this is a Canadian story. It's certainly an Alberta story, but there are other provinces that want to see that as well. And so that's why I think we're fighting so hard. It's of course because we believe in the industry, but also just the benefits that our industry provides, and the very real fact that reliance on oil and gas, it is not decreasing. It is increasing every single day. And as long as that global demand is going up, then we want to be, I've heard it said we want to be the best barrel, we want to be the last barrel. We want to be producing that energy for generations to come.
We've heard from the federal Liberal Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, about EVs and how, I think it's 2035, he wants 100% of any manufacturers to only sell EVs. I don't know if he realizes we live in Canada. And, we just had an outage here in Calgary in January. Minus, what was it, 40, minus 50?
It's, that policy was also just so preposterous. I mean, first of all, we would never think that it is, our job, certainly from our perspective, to tell people what kind of car they can drive. But you're exactly right. I mean, our grid, in addition to not being able to mandate what consumers buy, our grid would not have the ability to fuel all of those vehicles. And I mean, right now, here's again the funny thing, like when we look at the grid alerts that we've seen, and last year, we've seen an increase in grid alerts. And part of that is because, again, when you look at things like the clean electricity regulation and the uncertainty that creates when they have performance standards in there that have never been tested. So if you have a performance standard that's never been tested and technology that doesn't yet exist, nobody really wants to take that risk to start up additional natural gas baseload, which we do need for our grid, when then it has to be shut down in 10 years because we don't know that we can hit those targets. I mean, that's just wild to me. And thinking about just what that would look like on a day like the days that we faced in January, it again doesn't make any sense. And so kind of the same approach, though, to what we see on some of their policies is, it's not an area of federal jurisdiction. We're just going to, set this policy. We're going to put this idea out there. We're going to create some rules around it, and then we're going to leave it to everybody else to figure out how to do it. Right? And that's what they're doing on clean electricity, not an area of federal jurisdiction. It's an area of provincial jurisdiction, but they set these targets and say, well, the companies in the provinces will just figure it out. Yeah, sure. But then you've also put in place essentially provisions that if somebody does step up to provide power for that day in the middle of January, near the end of January, over the, they had 18 days of peaker capacity allowed, that somebody's going to go to jail for producing power. That's wild. Same thing on the oil and gas cap. The technology, CCUS, you can't make the assumption that we're going to have CCUS and all of these other technologies in place in 6 years when they haven't made any of the investments that they promised, like now we're talking 3 years ago, to make that technology happen. That's just not how this works.
Housing costs. Maybe we can talk about that. What are your thoughts on that? And what is the hope for Albertans?
We still have an advantage in Alberta over other places across the country when it comes to the cost of housing, but affordable housing is absolutely a top of mind issue for us. And, the Premier and our Minister, now Minister Nixon, they are working very hard, especially with municipalities, to look at how can we make sure that there is more in terms of availability, because that can help bring down some of the cost. How can we reduce red tape so that those houses can be built quicker? And how can we show like flexibility and different levels of government coming together to meet these demands? So, again, this is something that it's part of that affordability concern that Canadians are facing right now. And again, we haven't seen the cost of anything go down under this federal government, but it is something that we are taking up at the provincial level.
I have a good opposition of a leader, Pierre. Do you think if he comes into power, everything will be good?
I just think that right now we have a government that has just been so disrespectful of the views of Canadians, but even of our courts, right? I mean, when I raised the recent court decisions on Bill C-69 and plastics with Minister Guilbeault, essentially his response was, well, those are just opinions. Those aren't decisions, right? So disrespectful of the views of Canadians, but also disrespectful of our Constitution and our courts. And, I think that what you're seeing in the polls is Canadians want a change. So with any new government that would come in, and I don't want to speculate necessarily on what would happen there, but I do think that we need a common sense, pro-industry, pro-growth federal government as well. I think that would have a huge impact on investor certainty. I think it would have a huge impact on affordability. And you're seeing those commitments from the federal Conservatives to say, look, we're going to bring some common sense back to government. And, I hear them say, look, we can't fix everything overnight. No government can. But I think what you're hearing is a platform that is really representing some of the major concerns being shared by Canadians when it comes to less red tape, less government intervention, right? Limited government, less government, more access to affordable housing, helping to address affordability concerns, quite frankly, largely with the carbon tax, but I think just generally speaking. And so, I think we've got to have faith in the fact that, governments run on their platforms. We haven't seen any platforms yet. We don't even know when the next federal election is going to be. But right now, that's the thing. I mean, the Liberal government has a record of increasing costs and using ideology over common sense. And then we will have a federal Conservative Party that's been saying, look, we're going to bring common sense back to government and the voices of regular everyday people back to the table and start solving some of the challenges that everyday regular people across Alberta, whether it be families or seniors or young people who, can't afford to buy a home. I think that they have been really focusing on those issues that are top of mind for everyday people. And, when I think about what got me involved in politics, it was that. I mean, my first job was working in a small town cafe and hearing, my dad and others like talking over coffee row about the issues of the day. And same thing, it's why I like to door knock. I love asking people, what are your frustrations with government? What are your aspirations for our province? And how can I take those hopes and aspirations and then do something about it and be your voice? And it doesn't mean we're going to agree all the time. I mean, I had people, oh my gosh, like I met this couple back in 2018 and it was in a nomination. So in a nomination, I was running against 4 other Conservatives to be the representative for the United Conservatives. And this woman and I talked for, oh gosh, probably like 45 minutes, which you typically, when you're door knocking, you do not spend that much time on somebody's door. But, it was such a great conversation. Our values were the same. We care about the same things. I said this to her. I said, look, our values are the same, but you want legislation. I don't, typically, I value limited government, so more legislation is not typically my go-to. But I even said in this case, I actually think there's maybe a different way, or in my opinion, it's a better way to solve the problem. And I just said, so I might not be your candidate, and that's okay. But if I am elected and I am selected to be your representative, I hope that you take from this conversation that I will represent your views. And it's so funny because they came to an event that we had in the fall, and they were speaking to some other folks about what it was like to meet Rebecca. And I thought, oh gosh, like the time I told you not to vote for me. Typically not what you hear a politician say. But, from there, they realized that, hey, she listens to us and she's telling us the truth about what she thinks and what she's going to advocate for. And I think that that's important too, is be honest with constituents, because the last thing you want to do, if I tell you I'm going to do something and then I don't do it, I don't see why you would do that. My perspective is I'm here to represent people. It doesn't mean we agree all the time, but we have to stay focused on the things that are top of mind for everyday Albertans. And, I'm so grateful to live in this amazing place full of amazing people. And it's an honor to be doing this job.
Rebecca, we have rising food costs. Our farmers, our ranchers, people in the ag industry support all of Canada, actually. A lot of Alberta ag industry supports Canada. It feeds Canada. Is there hope for them? There's a drought happening. We're in El Nino. Inflation, carbon tax. Is there hope?
I would say yes. I'm an advocate of our ag industry as well. I spent part of my life growing up on a farm, and we did have cattle, just a very small herd. My dad was in the cow-calf industry, had, I guess, maybe around 65 to 80, maybe sometimes up close to 100 at any time. And as it turns out, I spent my whole day today meeting with folks in the ag and the cattle industry. And we have been talking a lot about, of course, just drought, but also, again, some of the pressures that they face, carbon tax and agriculture. You've been, I'm sure, hearing a lot about. And they really do appreciate, I think, our advocacy on that front. We've been working together with the ag minister and the ag industry, especially when it comes to drought in this year, given the current situation we're in. But we don't 100% know just yet what exactly that's going to look like. But we've been through this before, which is what gives us some optimism. And in Alberta, the last time we faced an El Nino in this level of drought was in the early 2000s. And the approach that was taken was a collaborative one. So it wasn't top down. It was, okay, let's see how much water do we have of the water that is already allocated, how much is being used, how much are we able to divert to other uses to make sure that everybody has access to water. And we've seen a lot of good work happening when it comes to water conservation as well. So how do we take some of the really great examples, whether it be in municipalities or today, some of our conversations that I was having were around the cattle industry. There's some great examples of folks that were creative with their water use and water reuse, I would say. And so I think it's not forcing this conversation. I mean, the Premier asked me to look into water allocations and how we can manage the water allocations, but I think it makes those conversations extra important to have right now. And so I would also say, in addition to that, I mean, last year we also saw a drought, not to the extent that we're expecting this year, but our government did step up to advocate for producers and to provide some supports. And, I know that this is something that RJ Sigurdsson, our Minister of Agriculture, he's really passionate about, and we are working together to figure out how we can mitigate the impacts on the ag industry and what we might have to do to support them down the road. So, I think the ag industry is very grateful for the open dialogue we've had, for how closely our ministries are really working together, because we don't want to do this in silos, and I don't think anybody benefits from that. I think it's important that we're all sitting there at the table. We had a town hall, I guess this was maybe a week ago now, and it was myself and Minister Sigurdsson and Minister McIver as well as, all of the major water users. So we had the ag industry, we had the irrigators, we had municipalities, we had the energy industry, and they all took time to join us on this town hall. But I thought it was really important for all three of us to be there, to be hearing the same questions, the same concerns, the same ideas that were coming in, and make sure that we're aligned, because I think sometimes the siloed government creates challenges as well, and we're definitely trying to do things a different way.
Things are challenging here in Alberta for many of us. Is there a message, Minister, that you could give to Albertans in terms of hope, encouragement, while you continue to fight for us and bring prosperity to our province?
Like I said, we have faced a number of challenges over the last number of years. And, whether that be economic downturns, we had an oil price crash when I was first elected. 2019, we didn't anticipate those things. Now we have a federal government that just is continually attacking our major industries and our way of life. And I would say, despite all of that, there is absolutely hope. By my very nature, I am an optimist. I always say I'm a realist, but I'm an optimist because I do believe that we have the ability to overcome some of these challenges. And like I said, I think seeing the pattern of the courts siding, in our direction and really reiterating what we have been saying all along, that this federal government is Premier always says they act in a lawless and unconstitutional way, and it's exactly what they've been doing. But I think that gives me hope. I remember I was driving when I was hearing about Bill C-69 and that decision, and I could just hear all of these, pings on my phone. So when I finally got downtown, got my phone out, there was kind of a lump in my throat thinking, oh my goodness, we've been fighting this fight and raising these arguments. Now we see the Supreme Court is saying, you know what, there was something to that. That is unconstitutional. Same thing on plastics. We're starting to see the tide turn, and then to hear Canadians talk about the importance of affordable, reliable energy and, opposing the carbon tax, not just here in Alberta or in Saskatchewan, but right across the country. To hear the frustration of provinces that are not being heard by the federal government, I think that encourages me, because we're starting to see all of those messages resonate. You still have a federal government who is disregarding all of it. But I am optimistic, because ultimately I believe in Albertans. I really do. I just think that the people here are so special, that we have faced so many challenges before. We've come through all of those challenges, again, whether it be economic downturns in oil prices, the droughts that we've faced in the past and are probably going to face this year. Albertans have always found a way to come together and to solve some of those greatest challenges and still come out as a leader and as a place of hope and opportunity. And I think we also see that in the number of people who are moving here right now and calling this amazing place home. So I am optimistic for our future. And I think the other thing I would say is, I just want Albertans to know that they have a government who cares and who is working hard every day to represent the best interests of Albertans.
Could we ever see you as Premier?
You know what? We have a fantastic Premier right now. I would say, I already ran leadership race before, but our Premier is doing such a great job. We came through what was one of the most negative and controversial elections I had ever seen. I have never seen an opposition party and the unions take that kind of approach with misinformation and personal attacks. I've never seen anything like it. And we managed to come out of that election successful. We have a Premier, Danielle Smith, who brought our colleagues together to say, look, we have a strong, united team. Our team is more united than ever. And, I don't always believe polls. I honestly don't. And things can change, of course, on a dime. But, we've seen the polling increase, that things are looking up, that Albertans see what's happening. They see that what the NDP was sharing during the election was not true. It was misinformation. You're not paying for a family doctor. And when it comes to a pension, every Albertan gets a vote. It's not me. It's not the premier. It's not us that are making that decision if that was ever the decision to make. But we're putting the information out there so Albertans can have a good discussion and then make a decision. And so I think people are seeing what that looks like. I think they're seeing a premier who is confident enough to stand up to the federal government, to tackle transformation in healthcare, to make sure that we have a system that empowers frontline workers and is there to support patients. And so, I'm really grateful for the leadership of our premier at, such an important time for our province as this. I think she's doing a great job. I think you'd hear that from any of our caucus colleagues. And, I think also just personally, I'm honored that she asked me to serve in this role at such a time as this.
Well, we'll have to get together soon.
I would love that. And I want to hear more about your story, because I think your story and you also embody that entrepreneurial spirit that is Alberta.
Thank you.
So maybe we should what I think you should do, obviously, I might have been talking to one of our mutual friends about it, but I think you should have an episode where we get to ask you questions.
I would love that. That would be fun.
Well, let's start scheduling it now, because this one took way too long to schedule.
The pressure's on.
We'll get Ryan to schedule it, and we'll turn the tables. Maybe you could have a few of your favorite guests come back, and we get to do a podcast featuring Zach.
Oh man, that's gonna be intense. Okay.
Who do I need to call?
Talk about some fun things, like a round table.
I love it. And then we can get the story of Zach as well, which I think people would love to hear.